If you'd like to read along, we'll be in the book of Luke. Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49. Luke chapter 6, verses 46 through 49. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house, who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the stream broke against it, immediately it fell, and the ruin of that house was great.
Just a reminder that Helen Deaton does have her cell phone with her, so if you would like to call her, she would probably appreciate contact with people. I talked to her yesterday, and she said she would appreciate if you would call sometimes. She has been having a little bit of problem. Some of her medication she was having hallucinations a little bit. So if you call her and she seems to be not herself, you might just be gracious and let her go back and rest for a little bit. That's okay. That's part of the healing process at this point. They have to give her a lot of medication because she's in a whole lot of pain. And so, but she would appreciate the calls. She loves knowing people are thinking about her. And her concern was, she asked me flat out, how many people were at church Wednesday night? And I said, there was a pretty good crowd here Wednesday night. And she said, well, that's good. She said, we need to be meeting together. We need it more right now. And I said, yes, Helen, we're doing the best we can, and we're taking care of that. So remember Helen in your prayers, and if you get a chance to call her, I know she'll appreciate it. As he surveyed the damage, Bill, he just couldn't hardly believe it. It was all ruined. Everything was. Everything he'd worked so hard for so many years, and it was all gone now. It's lying in a huge pile on the ground, and in just one instant, it was all gone. As he walked around, shifting through the debris, he began to think to himself, it really wasn't that bad of a storm. Sure, the winds were high, but look, all the other houses on my block are still here. They look like there never was a storm. I'm pretty sure I really messed up this time. I should have listened to the people who warned me about hiring that particular contractor, that he took shortcuts all the time. I should have listened to the people who warned me that I needed to be more careful while I was building and not just try to save every dime I could. But it made sense at the time to save as much money as I could for my family. My friends told me that storms would come, that we lived in a storm area. It was better to be prepared for that, but I didn't want to hear it. Yeah, I saved a little time and money, but look at me now. I'd do anything to go back and do things right. As he was about to leave and go back towards town, under what was once his little girl's bedroom, he found her favorite doll, Annie. As he picked up Annie, he clutched that soiled little doll, and tears flooded from his eyes. And he sobbed openly. It's all gone. Everything is gone. What will we do now? Jesus has been preaching for a while. We skipped right here the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon on the Plain, as Luke refers to it. And as we skip that, you need to go back and read the words. But Jesus has been teaching for a while, and as he's been teaching this, he's looking for a way to end his lesson. I was told one time when I was trying to learn how to be a preacher that you're supposed to make sure that you begin your lesson, and then you're supposed to make sure that you have a lesson, and then you're supposed to make sure you end a lesson, and then you're supposed to sit down and shut up and let everybody else take the lesson. Well, I'm pretty good at part of that sometimes, but Jesus was an expert at beginning a lesson. A lot of times he would ask us a question, and then he would end a lesson a lot of times with an illustration that brought the lesson home. And as he finishes this great sermon that he's preached, Jesus gives us our text today, and we're very familiar with this idea of the wise man built his house upon the rock and the foolish man built his house upon the sand. And that's the lesson that Jesus is giving here. He's saying that the most important thing is, where are you building the foundation? And he's not talking about our houses. He's talking about our lives. What's the foundation of your life? Where is the foundation of your life? I've known people in the past that the foundation of their life was their spouse. And they've built their entire lives around that relationship with their spouse. And when that spouse is gone, they no longer have a foundation. Their lives are shattered and destroyed. And you see quite often they either tumble into a depression that they can't come out of and eventually die, sometimes very rapidly after their spouse. Or maybe they just go from relationship to relationship looking to find that again, and they find themselves more miserable because the foundation was not the foundation. I've heard other people, their foundation is their work. I am really good at what I do. I'm the best at what I do. I'm very successful, and I'm able to work, and I work 70 hours a week, or I work 80 hours a week, and look what I've built. I had this, and now I've got this plus this, and now I've got this plus this plus this, and look at me, and look at how successful I've been. Look at my work. My life is my work. And you have something like an economic crisis or a health issue, and suddenly your back's not as strong, or your mind's not as strong, or the economy's not as strong. And now all of a sudden we see them and their foundation has been shattered underneath them. And there is nothing left for them to live upon because it's been destroyed. Other people, I've never been one of these because I've never been guilty of this. Their looks. I've never had those kind of looks, but I've known people in the past, and they got by just on their looks. Their smile was so great, and their hair was so perfect, and everything about them was so perfect that they could just skate through life. And you've known people like that it seemed like they got a promotion just because they look good. Seems like everybody wants them to be the president of their company or the leader, the face out in front, because they look good. And we want that person that looks good to be our spokesperson. We want that person to be out in public and out in front. And so they get the job just because they look good. But, you know, time has a way of affecting our looks. Don't tell that to some of them 90-year-olds that look 40 in Hollywood, but for the rest of us, time has a way of affecting our looks. It just does. And if our foundation is on the wrong thing, our foundation can be yanked out from under us. How sad that is. There's lots of turmoil in our nation right now. You see, storms are going to come, and there's lots of turmoil in our nation right now. There's the COVID-19. More than 100,000 Americans have died from COVID-19. And I know a lot of people are saying, well, it's no worse than the flu. It's no worse than the flu is. You know, in America, between 3 and 20% of the population gets the flu every single year. That's true. And there are nearly 200,000 hospitalizations for the flu every single year in the United States. Understand that. More than 200,000 hospitalizations every single year from the flu in the United States. There have been more than 100,000 deaths from COVID. Since 1973, between 3,000 and 49,000 Americans have died of the flu every single year. Every single year. Between 3,000 in the lowest year and 49,000 in the highest year, it averages somewhere around 17,000. There have been over 100,000 deaths from COVID-19. It's real. It's not just hyped up in the media. It's real, and we need to take the precautions necessary for that. Not saying that it's the worst thing that's ever happened in history. It's not the bubonic plague. It's not even the Spanish flu that they try to compare it to. But it is real, and we need to understand that. Bright light is, they're going to develop a vaccine. Until that time, we take care and protect ourselves a little bit. There's rampant violence and turmoil in our inner cities. You know, we're being told that it's all peaceful protests, and the protesters are even being encouraged to protest that much more. And in the wake of all these peaceful protests are burning buildings, looting, and rioting. The peaceful protesters in Little Rock burned down the Lewis Street Church of Christ. They threw fire bombs in there. That was pretty peaceful, I guess. The peaceful protests in Chicago resulted in the highest homicide single-day total since the St. Valentine's Day massacre with Al Capone. Those are the peaceful protests. There's more animosity and hatred and division in our nation's capital than I've ever heard of. And I studied politics a little bit while I was in college. My dad was involved in politics, and we saw a whole lot about how politics worked all around. In the earliest days, you may not know this, of our country, the southern states were going to secede from the Union when there were only 13 colonies. It was over some issues that they felt like they could not be equally represented. And so they had a great compromise. They called it the Great Compromise of 1787. You can go back and read that. And as you read that, you'll see how they kept the country together. A few years later, in 1803, they had to have another great compromise because the state of New York wanted to get out of the Union. They didn't like the way the Union worked. They felt like since there were more people living in New York City already than there were in entire states in the South, that they should have more votes than any of the other states get, and that the states should listen to them. Well, they managed to work that out. Not long after that, the Confederacy decided that they wanted to secede from the Union, and that rebellion was put down. Years later, other things happened throughout the time. They protested prohibition. They protested giving women the right to vote. They protested the draft, and they've protested just about every war our nation has been involved in. People have protested. But through all of these crises, our leaders have managed to maintain civility. Civility. You cannot communicate. You cannot compromise. You cannot find peace without civility and dignity towards one another. And when we sit around and we call each other names and we hate each other just simply because somebody sits on the other side of the aisle from where we sit, you cannot have peace. And yet that's what we see more and more of today. Storms? You betcha there's storms coming around our way and coming our way. Today is a tough time to live. And so my advice for today is just exactly what Jesus closed his lesson with. Let the Lord build your house. Psalm 127:1 says, unless the Lord builds the house, the laborer labors in vain. Doesn't do any good to build a house if you're not going to build it on the Lord, if you're not going to build it on the right foundation. And again, he's not talking about bricks and mortar and sticks. He's talking about our lives. We have to build our life on the Lord. And today I want to bring this concept home by looking at three questions. And the first one is, what house is it? And it is the house of our life. You know, it's what we think. It's what we do. It's what's important to us. It's who we are. When someone describes you to someone else, do they say, he's, I don't know, tall? She's tall. He's short. She's short. He's fat. She's not. You know, whatever it is, how do they describe? Do they describe you when they start describing you? He does this, he does that. Do they ever describe you as the first word they think of, she's a Christian, or he's a Christian, or he or she is a member of the Church of God? Is that how they begin when they describe us? It ought to be, because that's where our foundation is supposed to be. That's our life. We're supposed to build a foundation. There is no other foundation than to lay our foundation on the foundation of God. Beyond that, nothing else is going to work. It's going to be in vain to do it, because if we do it, we're building foolishly. We've already talked about some of these places where we try to put our trust, where we try to build our lives, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Oh, it may look good for a little while, But the first real strong storm that comes along destroys it. The first real strong storm that comes along can totally obliterate it. To attempt to build a family without God at the center, oh, how is that going to work? Because you see, it's God being at the center that allows us to openly respect one another, that allows us to openly appreciate one another, that allows us to openly love one another. All the things that bind the family together, that also allows us to openly chastise one another sometimes. Those are the things that build a family. And it starts with this relationship with God. To attempt to build anything in our life without God at the center is going to result in failure. The house that we're to build, he's talking about here, is this strong foundation with God, and it consists of more than what we are as individuals. You know, sometimes we think, hey, it's hard enough just to build my personal foundation on Christ, but it also consists of our contributions to the kingdom, to the church. You know, we use that passage in Hebrews a lot of time to chastise somebody that doesn't come to church. Do not forsake the assembly of the Lord, right? We like to quote that when we're talking about that. Have you ever read that in context to see what it's talking about? It's talking about how much we need each other. It's how much we need to encourage one another. It's about how much we need to support one another. Read the three little bears in Galatians chapter 6. I love that. Bear one another's burdens and bear with one another and bear in your own body the marks of Christ. Read about those three little bears and how much that has to do with us loving each other, with us caring about each other, with the foundation of the church being built on our relationship with God, individually and corporately. And see what Jesus is saying here. We need that. We have to have that. Listen to the words of Peter in 1 Peter 2, 4 and 5. As you come to him, the living stones. Oh, as you come to him, the living stones. We, me, you, are the living stones he's talking about here. Rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious to him. You also, like living stones, are being built into a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, offering spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. You see that? We're part of the most amazing thing in the world. We're the very stones that the kingdom of God is built with. The royal priesthood of Christ. We're a part of that. Each of us is a stone. And believe it or not, when you build a wall, every stone is important. You don't have to pull out very many stones before you destroy the whole wall. The house we're to build is the house of who we are. Who we are in our individual spiritual life, and who we are as we are corporately involved in the worship of God. The next question is, why should we let the Lord build our house? Why should we let him build a house? And the answer is because life is full of storms. Life is full of storms. You know, the winds of pain and sorrow, heartache, death, cancer, disease, disappointment, they just blow constantly, and they blow from every direction. And sometimes you've got no idea it's coming until, bam, it's there. You don't know there's anything wrong until, wow. You know, you go to the doctor and you have a routine visit, and the next thing you know, the doctor's office calls the next day and says, hey, we need you to come in as soon as possible. That's not good news. Unless it's Judd and you got your glasses quick. But if the doctor calls after you've been there, or if the doctor's looking, how many have ever been there and you've seen the doctor say, oh. You know, that's a scary thought. For all you know, he's got indigestion, but it sounds like the end of the world when they say something like that. Or when your doctor, who has been telling you for 40 years that he's the best doctor in the world, that he's the most qualified physician in the county, that you should trust him with your life and your health and your family and everything else, tells you, look, I can't handle this. I'm going to have to send you to somebody that's better than I am. That's scary. That's scary. There are a lot of storms that come when your children make a decision or a life choice that is absolutely contrary to everything you've ever taught them. And you watch them, and you can't help with that decision that they've made. You can't encourage them in that decision, but you can't hate them. They're still your children. And so you hurt for them, and your heart hurts for them, and the winds blow against your foundation. You know, we live in a state that often faces the threat of tornadoes. So much so that when a big storm cell comes over the Rockies and somewhere around Denver, they start tracking it. So much so that when the storms come in off the Gulf and they get into Texas and they start heading northeast and it looks bad, they start tracking it. The Weather Service in Little Rock starts tracking both of those different directions because either one of those could come right down on top of us at any minute, and they're watching it. You open up your AccuWeather app or one of your weather apps that you've got, or you go to the radio station and they're telling you there is a tornado watch. And then they'll tell you that a watch means that conditions are possible for a tornado to form. Then they'll tell you there's a tornado warning. Well, a tornado warning means, hey, the conditions are very favorable. There might actually be a tornado somewhere. And then all of a sudden the sirens go off and we go to our safe places, right? If you don't have a safe place, come up here and go to the basement. Rod and Nancy will be here. You won't be by yourself. And they won't be by themselves that way. So, but go to your safe place. We do that. We live in a place where we know what storms can do, and so we look for safety. We start taking precautions when we know about it. I like to play golf. I'm not very good at it, but I like to play golf. When I'm on the golf course, Rod and I were out there a week or so ago, and we're out there, and we saw lightning in the sky. And so I'm subconsciously counting, 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, 1,005. I get to 1,020 and I still haven't heard thunder yet. And I quit counting, and then a little bit later I hear thunder from the lightning. And Rod says, do you think we need to go in? I said, I think that's far enough away, we're okay. So we played, the storm went by, it didn't come anywhere near us. We played and we finished our golf round. However, I have been places before when I was outside or on the golf course, when I saw the flash and heard the crash at almost simultaneous times. You know what I did? I hurried to a place of shelter. We have enough sense to do that kind of thing because we know that we need a good solid foundation under us when a storm hits. And we need to be protected from physical storms. So why don't we worry about emotional or psychological or spiritual storms that may hit in our lives? Why don't we prepare for those like that? Because they're coming. They're going to happen. It's going to happen. Jesus says if we don't build on God, we're building on sand. We're foolish. And he said the condition of our house, when the winds come and the waves come, if we haven't built on the right foundation, it's not going to stand. It's going to collapse. Whatever, our lives are just going to be destroyed without God. You know, there are a lot of people who are working very hard to build their lives. But even though they may or may not know it, their labor's in vain unless it's built on the Lord. I think it's important that we understand that. Went to Joplin a few years ago. The tornadoes were so strong it pulled the grass up off the football field. You understand that. It pulled the grass up off the football field. 3 F5 tornadoes at once. At one time, 5 F5 tornadoes on the ground at the same time. Tornadoes usually travel about 45 miles an hour. You can't outrun them on foot. You can barely outrun them in a car, and if you're driving on a road, you can't outrun them in a car because roads turn, and they don't. But here it comes, instead of 45 miles an hour so that it hits, and then 3 minutes later it's past your town, these tornadoes were traveling at 7 miles an hour. They just stayed there and chewed everything up. They wiped Joplin out. It looked like a war zone. House after house, block after block. Everywhere you went, everything was in almost total rubble. The only way you could tell what streets were which is because the city had gone out and they had spray painted on the pavement at every intersection which streets they were, because every street sign in town was gone. Everything was gone, just about. The worst damage were in the 2 or 3 trailer parks that they used to have, because they didn't have any foundation at all. There was nothing left there. They picked them up and they carried them. Those storms carried them half a mile. Oh yeah, there were several houses that were destroyed, but there might be a room or two still standing. By the way, safest place might still be in a bathtub. We talked to somebody at Valonia. He said him and his 2 daughters were in the bathtub, and the tornado picked the bathtub up and threw them out in the field. What did he say, about 100 yards, 150 yards? They rode in that bathtub, and none of them were hurt. The fiberglass bathtub doesn't offer the same support as a steel bathtub does. But go to your safe place when you see a storm. But the most devastating things that I've ever seen, the most devastating storms that I've ever seen, weren't the ones that hit Joplin or Valonia or the Hurricane Ike or Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane just Sandy or any of the others, or even Andrew. No, the most devastating storms that I've ever seen are the storms that hit people's lives and crush their lives because they have no foundation. They've got nowhere to turn. They've got no hope because they didn't really have room for God in their lives. Sometimes they just didn't make room, or sometimes they didn't want Him in their lives. And when God's not the center of our lives, when the storms hit, there's not a foundation there. And instead of being like something that's built on a strong foundation, I'm pretty sure that Rod and Nancy wouldn't come up here and get in the basement if they didn't trust that they would be safer there than they would be someplace else. Wouldn't you rather have a strong foundation under you when the storms of life begin to assail your life? When the winds start to howl, the hail starts beating down, the rain is so fierce that you can't see, and all of the world around you is turning upside down. Wouldn't you like to have a strong foundation when that time comes? It's a little late to start building it then. It's not a pleasant sight. The third question is, how have you built your house? Where's your foundation? Where's your foundation? I knew a guy back several years ago. We worked together, and he was a chain smoker. And for those who smoke today, and for younger people who have seen people smoke today, you don't have very many chain smokers anymore because they can't afford it. Unless you're a millionaire, you can't afford to be a chain smoker. But he was a chain smoker. He would smoke one, and he'd light the next one off of that one, and he'd light the next one off of that one, and he constantly, that's all he did, is smoke. And I remember we were in a meeting one time, and they told him he couldn't smoke in the meeting. He said, well, I can't come. And they said, what do you mean? He said, I can't go 15 minutes without a cigarette. I can't go 15 minutes without a cigarette. But you know, he could go weeks without going to church. Tell me where his God was. Tell me where his real foundation was. And when he got lung cancer, he was surprised. Nobody else was, but he was. I think his doctor kind of felt like it took longer than he expected. What foundation have you built your life on? There's a whole industry that involves going into people's houses and fixing the foundations. You have a crack in your foundation, you call us and we can come in and we can fix that crack. You have a foundation problem, we can come in and we can jack your house up, we can redo the entire foundation and we can put it back down and we can redo your foundation so that your house will remain solid. Because foundations are important. And we understand that. Oh, it's expensive. It's really expensive. If you got a foundation issue, if you come in and you find a great big huge crack and you got a crack going up the side of your walls and the ceiling's starting to crack a little bit and you know you've got a serious foundation problem, you might as well figure that you're going to take out a loan to write the check to fix that. It's going to cost a lot of money to fix those foundation issues. But it's worth it compared to losing everything you have. And folks, in our lives, if we've built our lives on the wrong foundation and we're trying to fix it, it can be expensive. We may have to lose a relationship somewhere. We may have to lose something else that's going on in our lives, whatever it is that's keeping us from having God as the center of our life. Whatever our little g God is that's taken the place of the real God in our lives, we're going to have to give up. And so it can be very difficult to do, and it can be very expensive, but it can save our souls. It can save our souls. We live in a time of storms. We live in a time of turmoil. But if our foundation is strong, Jesus said we'll be like the wise man. If our foundation is strong, we'll stand through the storms and we'll prevail. If our foundation is not strong, Jesus said, just like that, the foolish man built his house upon the sand. That's what he said. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we'll give you a chance to do that as we've done the last few weeks by just standing where you are. We're going to sing I Am Mine No More to give you an opportunity to do that. And if you do respond, one of the elders will come to you to help.